June the 23rd is D-Day in more ways than one. That's when voters in the United Kingdom go to the polls to decide whether or not they want to remain as part of the European Union. But if you happen not to be in the UK or the EU, why should this potentially messy divorce between two state entities actually matter to you at all? Well, to answer that question, we need to establish what exactly is at stake here for the UK and her partners, starting with, of course, the costs. On one hand, if the UK does leave the EU, it could free up to £8 billion a year. That's the likely net contribution per year which the UK makes to the EU's budget. Now, whether or not, however, this number will actually translate into a solid gain then depends on something else, the wider economic effects if the UK does choose to leave the EU for good. And that's a fairly complex question to answer. If, for example, national income in the UK does fall by 0.6%, well, that will then not only wipe out that paper gain of £8 billion, but it could also saddle citizens in the UK with a lot more debt through more public borrowing, and between 20 to 40 billion pounds, more taxes and austerity. And that's even under the most optimistic scenario, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Now, the losses aren't just in the fiscal sense, they extend all the way to trade too. You see, the UK has tariff and customs free access to the EU, and beyond that, to the countries which have signed up to the 35 free trade agreements the EU has struck with, like, say, the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements the EU has been negotiating with African countries, for example. Now, over a third of UK exports to the EU alone would also be facing higher tariffs, and that doesn't even take into account the cost of non-tariff barriers, like having to then agree to meet EU standards on goods and services as well. But the thing is, though, with all these numbers that are flying around in this debate, it's worth remembering there's a huge amount of information we still don't know about the long-term effect a Brexit would have. The uncertainty isn't just how those negative effects, how big they really would be, which is exactly what the IMF argues over here. The question is not that there will either be or not be a negative effect. The question is the magnitude of said effect. So if you're watching this in any place that isn't the UK or Europe, you could probably argue that this divorce in the making really has absolutely no relevance to me. And the thing is, you could find support on that view from the IMF. You see, the fund is arguing that really outside the UK, the immediate short-term economic and fiscal damage would probably be in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Cyprus and Ireland, to name a few. And remember, Ireland is particularly important for us here in Africa because quite a few of our Eurobonds are listed over there. But in the meantime, if you're looking at damage in the short term outside the UK and the EU, these are the countries to look for.
Well, let's get some more insight into that. Britain's pound hit a 5.5-month high against the dollar, and stocks rose on Tuesday as worries diminished that Britons would vote to leave the European Union. Now, polls and surveys are, however, showing that the referendum is on a knife edge, and this has kept investors nervous. Now, two opinion polls published on Monday put the Remain camp ahead, but another gave Leave a slight lead. The dollar weakened against most major currencies, with the exception of the yen, which has retreated this week on indications that the campaign for Britain to stay in the EU has regained momentum. And looking at its impact on Africa, South Africa's rand extended 3 days of gains against the dollar as cautious optimism that Britons would vote to stay in the EU keeps global risk appetite intact. Now, by 7:01 GMT, the rand was trading at a 14.82 versus the greenback, up slightly from its New York close of 14.85. The currency had hit 14.76, adding to Monday's strong gains, as investors bet that the June 23rd referendum would not result in Britain leaving the EU. And here in Kenya, the central bank said that it has had enough foreign exchange reserves and funds available for an IMF standby facility to weather any fallout from the British referendum. Kenya's foreign exchange reserves stood at about $7.6 billion on June 16th, equivalent to 5 months import cover. In March, the International Monetary Fund approved 2-year standby facilities for Kenya worth about $1.5 billion, which of course can be drawn on if the East African nation faces unforeseen shocks. Well, let's get an update on what's happening with these polls over in Britain. Richard Bestick now joins us from London. Richard, welcome to the show. And of course, we've had huge names like George Soros source, and of course Nouriel Rubini warning of the implications of a Brexit. We also seen major investors in the UK and even David Beckham calling for a Remain vote. What are the latest polls saying?
Well, with around 36 hours to go before the polls open, the real polls, the polls that matter, will decide Britain's future inside Europe for a generation. We still have no idea of where they're going. A number of polls have flipped and flopped, giving a lead here to the Remain camp, those who want to remain inside the European Union. The Leave camp have had their leads as well. The Financial Times, the London Financial Times poll of polls, though, over the last couple of hours, has the two sides on 44% each. That means they're in a dead heat. In other words, this decision, this result, could go any way. Remember, it only means 50%. 51% of the vote will win it for either side. It could go either way, and we still don't know. The Prime Minister David Cameron has been out on the doorstep of number 10 Downing Street, making a final plea, largely to the older generation who are seen as more likely to vote to leave the European Union, saying, don't do it, don't vote that way. Think of the future for your children and your grandchildren. And remember that the decision on Thursday, with all its implications, is final.
Well, we'll certainly keep following that story. Thank you so much, Richard, for giving us that insight. Richard Bestick joining us, of course, in London. Now,